All right. Well, I see that it's 10:02, so I think we should get started, and I'm sure others will join us as we move forward. Hi, I'm Laurel Hansen, MACC's Program Manager, and I'm joined by my co-moderator, Clara Owen, MACC's Communications Director. We want to welcome and thank you for participating in this MACC Zooms in on the reopening and returning to workspaces. This convening continues a series of Zoom sessions that bring our MACC members together during the COVID crisis. We listen to our members and convene them around issues that matter to them. With the critical role nonprofits play, it's all the more important that we're able to fully reopen workspaces closed by COVID-19 and reactivate some programs thoughtfully and safely. Organizations face many unknowns and each workplace is different. Many of us are facing similar issues and similar questions. So we'll walk through some of those considerations as we need to weigh in on what these stay-at-home orders are lifted. So I'm very excited that we've all gotten together here today, and on behalf of your network, MACC, thank you for being here. Now we do have just a few directions for participating because we want you to be engaged in this conversation today. So we're going to certainly offer you the opportunity to share your comments and ask your questions. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can raise your hand in your participant list, and we can unmute you and you can verbally share your comment or question. And then there's also the chat window. So feel free to add your comments, questions, and input in the chat. Encourage you to do that. All right. So we have a great group of members who have registered for today's event. So we want to just take a few minutes up front to allow you to introduce your organization. We know there are many of you representing our organizations. So we'd like maybe one or two of you to raise your hand. We want to unmute you, and we'd love to hear who you are, who your organization is. And then it would be helpful if you could just make a comment about your current status. So are you fully open? Are you partially open? Or are you just now starting to open or think about reopening? So if you would do that. Do we have anyone on the webinar today from Alexandra House? If you raise your hand, we'll unmute you. Oh, and I'll keep going and we can just raise your hand. Avenues for Youth. Oh, I see Catherine. Is Catherine Avenues?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Catherine.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Catherine Mears with Avenues for Youth. I'm the executive director. We support over 300 young people every year who are experiencing homelessness. And we have 2 physical shelters which are open and fully staffed. All other staff, including staff who work in our community-based programs and our administrative staff, are currently working remotely. We haven't had to lay off or furlough anyone. So we're all working, some on-site and some remote.
Thank you, Catherine. Welcome. Anyone from Banyan? Oh, there's Joni. Hi, Joni.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joni Essenberg. I'm the Executive Director of Banyan Community. And we're so excited because on Monday we start summer programs with all of our kids. Wow. And so that's going to be, it's been a great big planning process. We have reorganized our entire building. But we are so excited to start that program on Monday with our kids. We continue to reach out to families both virtually and dropping off any food or deliveries that we need to make. And we have staff on site that are doing program delivery, and then some staff that are working remotely. So kind of balancing those 2 scenarios.
Great. Thanks, Joni, for the update, for being here today.
Mm-hmm.
Cappy? Anyone from Cappy on today? How about Change Inc? Anyone from Change Inc on today? I see some hands raised. See a Suzanne. Is a Suzanne?
Yes, it is. Good morning.
Hi.
Hello, I'm Suzanne Callanan with Change Inc., the HR manager over here. And we have about 150 kids at our GAP school that come from, the war-torn countries and a very extreme poverty. And then we also have about 40 therapists and work with the community, especially the younger teenage at-risk kids. So
Great. Welcome. Thanks for being on.
thank you.
East Side, I think of the Michelle. Is there Michelle from East Side? There's Michelle. Hi, Michelle. Get you unmuted.
Yes, hi. My name is Michelle Kornowski for Eastside Neighborhood Services. I'm the Director of Human Resources, Operations and IT there. And we have some programs that are currently up and running, our food programs and our daycare. We're a multi-service agency, so and we're getting ready to be bringing staff back to operate out-of-school youth time programs as we're trying to do that. And we're trying to figure out how to ease people back in who want to come to the site, but for the most part, we're still continuing to have staff work from home who are able to work from home.
Excellent. Thanks for the update and thanks for being on. How about Emerge or Family Enhancement Center? Any leaders from those organizations? And if we've missed you, if we've already passed over you, keep your hand up. We'll circle back. FamilyWise, is FamilyWise with us today? Ham Clinic? How about Interfaith? Do we have any friends from Interfaith? Raise your hand. Keystone? We also have registrations from MACC and Neighborhood House. Raise your hand if you're on from those organizations. We have Shad from Neighborhood House. Hello, Shad.
Hi, everybody. As you just heard, I'm Shad from Neighborhood House. I'm the Director of Social Enterprise and Events. We have been running our food program in person. Everything else has remained virtual and will continue to remain virtual through the summer. We're looking at a few programs potentially opening in July, but hasn't been confirmed yet. We did do some layoffs, just we had to let the facility folks, unfortunately, for the most part, go on furlough. And we closed our social enterprise in downtown St. Paul permanently. COVID kind of wiped us out of the food business there. So.
Yeah, you've been through a lot there at Neighborhood House. Thanks for making time to be on with us today, Shad.
Thanks for setting this up.
Yeah. We have another Michelle Ness from Prism. I see her hands up. Hi, Michelle.
Hi. Yep, Michelle Ness here with Prism. We have closed access to our building effective March 16th, but continue to do food distribution. It's a drive-through model. People stay in their car, so it's no touch. We have seen our numbers significantly increase, so we've been busy. Continue to provide housing, homeless prevention services, and probably won't have any thrift shop activity until the fall in all likelihood.
Mm-hmm. All right, and it looks like, is there a Dan? And Dan, somebody coming on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, Merrick. Hi, Dan.
Good morning. Merrick has been implemented a couple different strategies. All staff have the capacity to work remotely, and all staff have taken advantage of that, while all staff have also been available to work in the office, staggered office hours. We've implemented protocols, as I'm sure others have, with masks and social distancing and hand sanitizers and disinfectants and all those kind of things. We've been doing daily food distribution, curbside, as Michelle mentioned, and we're also doing Meals on Wheels distribution, though that daily schedule has been reduced to 2 days a week. We're looking to increase that to maybe 3 days a week. And we're also looking to increase staff spending more time in the office, and that'll be staggered over the next couple of weeks. We also have purchased some additional acrylic barriers and things that assist at our front desk and in our cubicles. So we're trying to follow the protocols that we're aware of and looking forward to other suggestions people might be able to pass along. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Daniel, for being on the call today and for sharing your update. I see that Burnell from FamilyWise might be on there. Hi, Burnell.
Can you hear me?
You got it. Yep.
Excellent. Sorry, I raised my hand a little late.
Sorry.
So FamilyWise our child care center has been open the entire time as an essential service. Our agency is locked to appointments only at this point. And so we have started to phase in some in-person supervised visitation, but the agency is essentially locked for appointment only. And the next phase of our reopening would include potentially allowing some home visits to occur in the community in external outside settings. We've secured masks, both cloth and surgical, and face shields to hopefully provide some of that productive gear for all of our folks. While we're phasing in, we are also looking at trying to stagger our client work to switch between being face-to-face, either in our center or in the community, and then virtual the next time to allow some of that time distancing. And yeah, I guess that's what I would say. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Burnell. Thanks for being here. Any members from PCYC today? I see Ann Long is on. Good morning, Ann. Ann, our board chair, welcome to you today.
How about now?
We gotcha.
All right, great, thank you. We closed when the schools closed in March, but did virtual learning for our after school and distance learning for our high school. Just graduated virtually 43 students.
Wow, congratulations.
Yep, that's fun. We will be doing virtual programming this summer school plus our after school programming. Both will be done virtually with activities and distance learning and so on. And the Capri Theater construction has continued without stop. So we're still looking for a soft opening, hopefully this fall.
Wow, that's amazing. Can't wait for that. Thanks, Ann, for being here. Any friends from Simpson here today on the call? Simpson Housing. Looks like we've got a hand up. Christina.
Christina Giese, the Director of Volunteer Engagement with Simpson.
Hi.
Our shelter, in South Minneapolis has been open 24 hours for the last few months. So those staff have been working really hard in direct service roles. Our other staff have been mostly working from home, doing some visits at a distance, but we're looking at increasing that and bringing folks back to the office in safe ways. It's good to hear from all of you today.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. How about St. Stephen's? Members from St. Stephen's today? For Survivor Resources? Ujamaa? La Crèche? Valley Outreach? I see a hand. Sandra, welcome.
Hi, this is Sandra. I'm Director of Finance and Administration here at Valley Outreach. And as many of the others who are food providers have mentioned, we've been open. We're doing a drive-up model currently and working towards higher levels of choice. Our staff have been teamed and rotating on site, and we're just now moving to bringing everyone back on site and then gradually bringing our volunteers back. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a big step too, that whole volunteer consideration. Thanks for being on the call. And last but not least, Southside Family Nurturing Center, Sabathani, either organization have attendees on today? Georgia, welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Yes, Sabathani Community Center. I'm Georgia Marinko-Vomorian, manager of our senior program. We have been physically shut down since the closure. Our building, however, has been open Monday through Thursday with our food shelf, which is now the drive-through model. We have had staff in and out working from home and coming in trying to do the necessary upgrades in order to be able to open our huge building to our tenants as well as participants. We are now partnering with MDH and doing COVID testing in our parking lot the month of June on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, which just started this week.
Wow.
We've also, in this tumultuous time, have hosted some emergency meetings with the mayor of Minneapolis and council members regarding the restructuring of the police department. But the building itself is in limited open session for some tenants, but no clients yet. So we do not have a date yet on when we will officially be open, but right now it's Monday through Thursday. And of course our food shelf is in full swing.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's the case for some of you, some MACC members, certainly for Sabathani, not only operating your own programs, but having many, many tenants in your space. So extra complex. And thank you for being here today. And thanks to everyone. If we missed anyone, raise your hand. We'll certainly circle back for introductions. Really thank everyone for joining in this conversation and today. And we're going to get to the presentation next, but just before we do that, we want to kick it off with some poll questions. And that will really help inform some of the conversation that occurs. We have a quick series of 5 poll questions we'd love everyone to take a minute to respond to. So we'll start with poll question number 1. Claire is going to launch that, and everyone can respond by voting on their screen. All right, and there's the results for poll number 1. How many employees? Most folks have 50 plus, but a substantial amount have below that as well. All right, poll question number 2. Are you an essential business that continued in-person operations during the stay-at-home order? So very strong results in question number 2. So primarily essential businesses continuing operations. Okay, poll number 3 will be next. Remote work. To what extent can your employees perform their jobs remotely? So mostly a mix, some remote, some in person. Question number 4. Social distancing. To what extent can employees maintain social distance in the workplace? So again, mostly a mix, but there are plenty who can't, and that's especially challenging. And our last question, number 5. Do you have a written preparedness plan? Plenty of folks appear to, and some maybe don't yet, but are working on it. All right. So we really thank you for participating in the polls. That it's helpful to know where we're starting here today. So now I'd like to proceed by introducing our speaker. We're really so fortunate to have Sarah Riskin with us today. Sarah is an attorney with Nilan Johnson Lewis law firm. Sarah's a labor and employment advisor and litigator. She partners with employers of all sizes and industries, from Fortune 100 to small nonprofits. She helps identify creative and practical solutions to workplace challenges, and her practice includes advising and defending employers in administrative proceedings, arbitration, litigation, assisting clients with policy development, performance management, compliance, and other trainings and investigations. And because of our current environment, she now also has a COVID-19 employment expertise, and I'm sure that's not something a year ago she thought would be in her wheelhouse. But we're so
even 6 months ago.
so lucky that she has developed this leadership and is willing to share with us. We're just really appreciative of your time, Sarah, and the information that you're going to share with MACC members today. So I just want to mention to everyone on the webinar, you're welcome to ask questions along the way. You've got a lot of options. You've got raise your hand and we can unmute you for your questions and comments. We've got the chat room, and there's also, I think, even a Q&A window if that's your preference. But chat room's great, raise your hand is great. We'll take questions along the way, and if time allows at the end, time for more questions. Now I'd like to welcome Sarah. And Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, Laurel. I will test my technology and share. Oh, I cannot share my screen while someone else is, so I'll share my screen. There we go. Now I will share my screen. That's shared the wrong one though, I think.
Looked good to me.
Oh, really? Well, in that case, it only shared the wrong one for me. All right, well, we'll see how it goes.
That looks like us, June 11th.
Okay. Even though we tested this ahead of time,
seeing your agenda.
Yep. All right. I'm just not seeing my notes, but that's okay. I probably don't need my notes anyway. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Laurel, for the introduction. Sorry for the slow start, everybody, on that just now. This is an overview of the agenda. Laurel already introduced me, but I'm a labor and employment attorney at Nilan Johnson Lewis in Minneapolis. It's worth noting I have a number of clients who are nonprofits. I also worked in nonprofits before I was a lawyer, so I have a very special place in my heart for nonprofits. So this is an overview of the agenda for today, the topics that we'll cover. The returning from furlough is just a very quick thing, but I know that at least some of you did say that you had folks on furlough, so I just want to address that. And then talk about the things that you need to do in preparing to return to work, the preparedness plans, which a number of you already have, but I'll address those quickly, and what to do when you've got employee illness and exposure issues as well. As Laurel said, if you've got questions, please use the chat function or, in some way let us know. There's a lot of information in here. We may not get through all of it, but I'm aspirational, so we'll see how it goes. This introduction, you've already had now an introduction to me, and we've done the polls already, but the state of affairs, everybody knows this, but what I want to address is just the idea that things change rapidly, and it's it's slowed down for sure. There was a period of time where every day was something different. But from a legal perspective, what's important to know is there are lots of agencies, government agencies providing guidance. And sometimes it's in the form of actual laws that have been passed, and sometimes it's regulations, and sometimes it's just guidance that is put out there. And many of the agencies change their guidance on a regular basis, and most of them don't provide any indication to the public that they have updated their guidance. So I say that just as kind of a level setting understanding that we're providing information. I'm providing information, to the best of my knowledge of what's accurate now. I can say that the EEOC updated stuff after we started this call this morning. So just know that many of these things still continue to change regularly. We already went through the poll questions. That was helpful, and having everybody introduce themselves also was just helpful for me to know. So very quickly, returning from furlough. And when you are returning from furlough, particularly if you're not returning everybody, I just want to address that quickly because I know that's happening with some folks. If you're returning everybody, then you call everybody back from furlough. If you are only returning some people, there's the question of how do you decide who to return? And the best advice we have on this is that you want to have objective selection criteria. So maybe you take the most senior people first, or you are looking at particular roles and calling people in from those particular roles. If you are ready to return some but not all, you can ask for volunteers. Just make sure that you're kind of prepared for how that's going to go. And one thing to know is that we're in a very unique world where there are lots of folks on furlough who would prefer to stay on furlough right now, both because they are getting more money with the unemployment boost, and that'll run out in the end of July, but right now they're getting more money that way, and because people are scared. So it's good for you to know that this is kind of a unique situation. And if you're in a position where you're calling people back, if you're in a position where you're calling some back, but you don't have to call everybody yet, and you can give people the option to self-select, that might be great because you might have people who really do want to come back and that can kind of meet your needs. But if you need to call people back and people are not wanting to come back, you need to know that you have the right to have your employees working. And if you need people there, you can say to somebody, well, I need you to come back. If you're not coming back, I'm taking that as a resignation. And it feels very harsh, but it is legitimately something that's happening in a lot of workforces right now. The impact on unemployment benefits. This is also unique because usually employers are not so excited for their employees to be getting unemployment benefits, but right now a lot of employers do want that. If you make a job available for somebody and they don't come back, they are no longer eligible for unemployment. And it's not your job necessarily to educate employees on their rights for unemployment. Most employers try to stay away from it, but it's something that you should know. And you can certainly say to your employees, you don't know how that's going to impact their eligibility, or it might not make them eligible. It's just something that's worth knowing. I will very quickly, it's actually addressed later in the slides, but since I mentioned unemployment now, I also want to acknowledge that nonprofits are in a unique role where you don't necessarily have to pay into the unemployment fund. You could be what's called a reimbursing or self-insured nonprofit. There's an article that will circulate that addresses that, but I'm imagining if you are self-insured or self-funded, then you know that unemployment's actually more expensive for you. If there are questions about that, throw them in the chat. Otherwise, I can address that if there's time. Realizing one thing here. Okay, so returning to work, preparedness plans and other, or the sources of obligations. Obviously, when you're calling people back, all of this is about risk and minimizing risk. And on the one hand, you don't want to be, you don't want anybody getting sick, and you're also trying to minimize, so you're trying to minimize exposure, and you're also trying to minimize your liability. So there are a couple of different places where this comes from. The first is OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act, I think it stands for. But there's what's called the General Duty Clause, which is that employers have a general duty to furnish to each employer to each worker a place of employment which is free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. And so a lot of times OSHA stuff comes up with, the obvious things that people think of are like manufacturing plants and things like that. But that's also where COVID-19 is coming in now, where there's this risk that is now present in the workplace that we hadn't seen before, and infectious diseases can be one of the issues with COVID. I don't know if these hyperlinks will work or not. If I click on it, let's see if it does anything. But there's a document guidance on preparing workplaces for COVID-19. Doesn't look like it's loading right now. Or if it is, it's only loading on my screen. But OSHA has put out a publication that it's like 35 pages long, and it goes through all sorts of things to think about when you are looking at reducing workers' risk of exposure. And obviously, as people were talking about what you're doing, there's a range of what sort of exposure there may be in the workplace. And some workplaces have much lower risk exposure. OSHA, the agency, actually has categories where it determines higher risk and medium risk and lower risk in terms of exposure. Any place that is public facing, I don't remember which organization is actually doing COVID-19 tests, but that is obviously going to be a higher risk. Healthcare places are going to be higher risk. But if you go through this guidance, it's a little bit outdated because it's a couple months old now, which in our world is outdated. But it really does have a lot of detailed ideas of how you can address risk and things that you can do to prepare. So it's a good resource. It's a good place to start. The CDC, there are a number of agencies that have guidance, but the CDC also has guidance that is talking about getting a workplace ready. Let's see, I have a link for it, but that's not working right now. And then obviously there's another source of the Minnesota, there are all these executive orders, there's agency guidance. If you go to staysafeminnesota.gov, that starts the rabbit hole of where you can click through and start reading different things. And then, so you have to comply. You have OSHA general duty clause that you must comply with. There are all these agencies that have different guidance, some of which you have to comply with legally and some of which is just guidance. And then Minnesota, the executive orders also gets to laws. And then you have a litigation risk that we would like to think that everybody is being as reasonable as they can be, and there would be good kind of checks and balances right now. When people are getting sick, what it should be, and what we've all kind of assumed it would be, is that if somebody is exposed to COVID in the workplace and gets it in the workplace, that would be a workers' comp claim, and it would be limited to a workers' comp claim, or if you're not providing all of the right protection, then there could be an OSHA investigation also. But there have also now been lawsuits filed against employers that are trying to get it out of workers' comp. So an example is there was a lawsuit filed against McDonald's by employees and also household members of employees claiming a nuisance, that McDonald's wasn't following enough procedures and kind of protective procedures, and that it's a public nuisance. Most of us thought that would be dismissed, but right now the court has said they're allowed to continue with that case. We don't know how it's going to end, but these are some of the things. I'm not trying to scare you, but these are things that you kind of need to be thinking about as you are making your decisions about how to proceed. I will say, as all of you were going through and talking about what you're doing, I think many of you are probably as knowledgeable and have spent as much time now on all of these resources as I have, because it does seem like you are all you're very aware of the different precautions. So maybe it's more preaching to the choir with you. So the preparedness plans and other considerations. In Minnesota, Governor Walz ordered businesses, it started with the non-critical infrastructure businesses. Obviously, when everything was shut down with the stay-at-home order, essential businesses were allowed to keep operating, and every other business could operate if it could do so remotely. And then Governor Walz started opening things up, and he came up with, or the state came up with a preparedness plan. And so businesses that wanted to resume in-person operations have to have a written preparedness plan that is certified by an officer of the company, and all employees have to be trained on it. And there's a template preparedness plan that is out there. I have, there are things about it that are great, and there are things that I don't love, but the preparedness plan generally requires employers to identify a number of specific topics. What are they going to do for screening employees? What are they doing for sanitation procedures and disinfecting? What other policies are you putting in place for if somebody is sick and they have COVID or presumptive COVID? There's a number of kind of topics that have to be covered, and you can go online and use this template preparedness plan that's put out by the government to start as a starting point. Now, I will say it's a limited plan, because it identifies that you have to address, for example, what you're doing for sanitation and disinfectant, but it doesn't actually give you examples of policies that you could put into place. So just know, if you are going to put together the plan for the first time, you need to save a little bit, plan ahead that it'll take you a little bit of time. I raise these because it started for non-essential businesses, but now they're actually going to be required for all businesses, even the essential, the critical infrastructure. You have to have them in place by June 29th. So there's 29% of you that said, no, you don't have written preparedness plans yet. This is something you're going to have to do in the next couple of weeks. So specific considerations, and this is not necessarily just for reopening when people have been remote. I should say that if you have continued operating in person, just like everything else with COVID, flexibility is just very important. So these are things to think about. If you haven't thought about them yet, you probably have, but if you haven't, now's a good time to go back and think about them. You can always adjust, as we're all trying to get through this. So social distancing and physical workspace modifications. I can't remember who it was who said, but somebody was talking about having plexiglass set up. So on the physical workspace modifications are all aimed at also social distancing, right? We all know at this point that we're supposed to social distance in the workplace, and in some facilities that is fine and you can easily accomplish it, and in others you can't. But to the extent you can, you should be requiring social distancing in the workplace, and then also looking at what physical modifications can you make and should you make. So let's say you have people in cubicles. Can you put plexiglass up? Can you separate cubicles enough? Can you put people actually in offices? What's your air space like? Are you able to update your ventilation systems, for example? So those are things that you want to think about, and the preparedness plan will help you with that. But there's also guidance, the other guidance that I referenced before, especially that the OSHA guidance, the 35-page document, goes through a number of different things. Personal protective equipment, PPE. This is another one of those acronyms that nobody knew until recently, and now everybody knows it. But you may need to be providing PPE to your employees. And if employees need PPE, it's your job to provide it for them. It can't be on the employees in order to do that. I see there's a Q&A, I'm just gonna look at it. Oh, where can you find the template written preparedness plan? If the hyperlink, we're gonna send out the slides afterwards, and I'm hoping the hyperlink will work. It will take you directly to it, but otherwise, if you go to Stay Safe Minnesota, and then I don't remember exactly which link you click on because there are so many, but if you play around with those, you should be able to find it. You can also Google MNDEED, DEED, preparedness plan, and that might also take you to the landing page for it. I think there are like 10 different ways to get to the preparedness plans through the various websites. So PPE, you may have a duty to provide it. Obviously, if you're in Minneapolis right now, there's the kind of order from the mayor to have masks, but That doesn't necessarily apply in all workplaces. That only applies in workplaces where members of the public are coming in. There's not otherwise a requirement at this point for employers to make employees wear masks, but certainly you can encourage it. And if you are going to require it, you have to provide it yourself. You may also need to provide some sort of like other modified PPE. You might need to provide gloves, gowns, depending on what the job is. But that's something that's very specific to your workforce and to what your business does and to what the individuals are doing. Fever checks and testing. This is kind of a big, interesting thing. So typically employers are not allowed to conduct medical examinations. Under the ADA, you're not allowed to conduct a medical examination unless it's job related and consistent with business necessity. And taking an employee's temperature is considered a medical examination. During the pandemic, the EEOC came up with guidance that it issued that said employers are permitted to take employees' temperatures during this pandemic to basically try to screen out COVID. So we're in a unique role, in a unique place where a government agency has explicitly blessed taking employee temperatures. That being said, generally I would recommend against it. There may be some situations where it's very important to be doing it, and that's probably going to be more in healthcare situations and things like that. But here's why at this point I would recommend against it. The first is that it's not a proxy for whether you have COVID-19, because we know that you can be asymptomatic. So taking people's temperatures doesn't necessarily tell you whether somebody has COVID-19, and there are other reasons somebody might have a fever anyway. So it would give you information, but it's not perfect. But really the reason that I recommend against it at this point is because there are a whole host of kind of other issues that arise when you're talking about fever checks. For example, you have to keep medical information confidential. Employers all have to keep medical information confidential. So who is going to take the employees' temperatures? Is it going to be somebody else at work, and then they have information, they have knowledge about their coworkers' medical information? Are you going to hire somebody? Is the person trained? What sort of thermometer are you going to use? Is there a way for you to do it contact-free? So that's just kind of a bunch of issues that arise when you're taking temperatures at work. What if you just want people to take their temperature at home? That's fine, but if you have non-exempt employees, there's a question about whether having them take their temperatures at home is actually work. It could be considered to start their workday, which means if you've got somebody who lives a half an hour away or 45 minutes away, but you make them take their temperature before they come to work, you might now have to pay for everything they do from the time they take their temperature until they're done with work for the day. You might have to pay for their commute time. Maybe they took their temperature earlier in the day. And then they did a couple of other things. So there are just so many questions that arise from a fever check that I just think it's it just becomes risky. You can certainly do it, but you just have to know that there are risks. There are ADA risks in terms of confidentiality. There are potentially exposure risks depending on how you're doing it, and then you have wage and hour risks. What you can do instead is the Minnesota Department of Health has this nice little checklist. I think that I may have it on another screen, so I'm not going to talk in detail about it, but there's a nice checklist that talks about symptoms, and you can tell your employees, I want you to monitor, employees should all monitor for symptoms and don't come to work if you're experiencing any of them. So rather than, they'll probably end up taking their temperatures, but rather than requiring it, just tell them to monitor for symptoms. I'm gonna actually go to work schedule modifications, and then I will come back to community third-party exposure. So another thing when you are looking at considerations, what you want to do in general is just limit exposure, right? So social distancing is one part of it, but another thing to think about is whether you can, if you're calling people back to work, can you change schedules? Let's say you have a lot of people in cubicles that are close together. Can you have some people come in earlier in the day and have some people come in later, or trade off days when people are coming in? Maybe people still work remotely part of the time, but you alternate alternate days, or better yet, alternate weeks. And that way you can have a deep disinfectant in between. I'm going to take a sip of water and read this question that came in. Okay, so the question is, we provide a no contact thermometer for staff to take their own temp at the beginning of shift as part of answering the questions of, do you have any symptoms? They do not document their actual temp. There's not actually a question, but that's just what's being shared by one person. That's fine. It's if they're not documenting their actual temp, that's fine. Then you don't have to worry about your records. But if somebody has a fever, then you do need to be thinking about what are you doing to record it. And maybe you're even recording when people say they don't have a temperature. So you just need to think about what the recording requirements might be and what the restrictions are on them. And the EEOC has some guidance. You're allowed to keep a log. You just have to keep it confidential. So that's fine. And if they're taking their temperature at the beginning of their shift, you're probably better off erring on the side of compensating them for that. So make sure that they're already logged in on kind of the time clock. Community third-party exposures. Based on what I'm hearing, this is certainly an issue that's coming up for some of you. If you are not in a standalone building, so people are going to be coming to work, and either you're in, you're a tenant in a space where there are going to be other businesses that are running, or you maybe you are the landlord, as we've heard from one. Then you want to think about, what ability do you have to control the other traffic, the other foot traffic that's happening in your space? Is there something you could do where you could have a dedicated employee entrance, and therefore employees are only coming in, they're coming in directly to your space, they're not having to come in contact with other people? Are there shared restroom facilities? Are there shared tenant lounge spaces? You want to kind of make a list of all of the different ways that you're able to control who's coming into your space and what contact is happening within the workspace. And then if you can, have conversations with other tenants. See if there's a way from the building management to have lines, can you get some signage up that supports the idea of social distancing within the building? Can there be tape put on the floor to create traffic patterns so that you can minimize exposures within the building? There was a question that came up about from a shelter where we've got employees, but they're also working in a shelter where there are youth staying, and what can we do about that? To the extent possible, you probably want to let people work remotely because you want to minimize exposure, but that's also not practical. We know that there are people who have to work in person, and that's part of what critical infrastructure is. What I would say is to go to the OSHA guidance and read about the different levels of risk, and then try to take whatever, figure out which category of risk you are. You're probably going to be in a higher risk category, and then try to follow whatever OSHA is telling you the best you can do is the best you can do. And I should say, when we're talking about kind of the litigation risks and liability issues, generally we are assuming that if you follow the agency guidance, you go and you have a good faith effort to figure out what level of risk your workplace presents, and then you follow the OSHA guidance on what you need to do for that level of risk. We're generally considering that to be a defense. We don't know if that's how the case law is going to come down, but that's what we think is going to happen with the courts. The courts are going to say, as long as you are following the agency guidance, then you are okay. Could we record the information without recording their name? That question came up with the temperature checks. I think that really depends on yeah, I mean, you'd have to look at the EOC guidance on the record logs, and if all you're doing is making sure that you've had X number of people checked and they don't have, none of them have a fever, fine. But I think you really want to be thinking about what the purposes of recording, and if you're trying to record over time, you know, the same, if you're trying to track one person every day, I'm not sure that removing their name is necessarily going to help you on that. There's one more chat. Oh, goodness. 5-minute warning. Okay. I'm just going to keep going and see how we do. Employee refusal to work. Sorry, I missed that. There are, OSHA does have a statutory provision that gives an employee a legal right to refuse to work if they believe that the working condition clearly presents a risk of death or serious harm, and they've asked the employer to eliminate the danger, and the employer has failed to do so, and the employee refused in good faith, and that a reasonable person would agree that there's a risk of death or serious injury, and if there's not enough time for OSHA to otherwise look into it. So there are a number of things that have to happen in order for an employee to legally refuse to work. If you have an employee who's refusing to work, it's probably a good time to just chat with a lawyer about it, so that you can assess whether it is a legal right to refuse or not. If they don't meet the test for a legal right to refuse, and generally, if you're following the CDC and OSHA guidance and Minnesota Department of Health, they probably don't have a legal right to refuse, then that's generally considered a resignation. But you want to make sure you don't terminate somebody, or tell them you're accepting their resignation. You don't want to terminate somebody if they do have a legal right to refuse. So it's a good time to just check with a lawyer. So critical infrastructure workers, the rules are a little bit different for critical infrastructure workers. And I guess I haven't told you the rules for non-critical infrastructure, but basically there's federal guidance that says that asymptomatic workers who have potentially been exposed, this is about exposure, an employee who has been exposed to somebody who has COVID, and exposure here is defined as being either in the same household or being in close contact with someone. I think we can say that that's probably an hour's worth of close contact, but they've been within 6 feet, and that's within 48 hours before the other person became sick, before they started having symptoms. Under the CDC guidelines and under the CISA guidance, an individual who has been exposed but is asymptomatic can still work. If you're critical infrastructure, you need that person to be working, they can still work. And the CDC guidelines tell you things to look at pre-screen, but I will tell you that all of these are probably things you're going to be doing anyway. And most of you, especially because you're nonprofits to the extent you can, I think are probably going to have that person not work for a period of time if you're able. But you want to pre-screen here. The CDC does advise taking temperatures and assessing symptoms, but we would advise for everybody to assess symptoms. And keep monitoring them, have that employee wear a mask for 14 days. Obviously everybody should social distance anyway, and then you want to clean and disinfect all areas as you are able to. Send home if symptoms develop. And if symptoms develop for anybody, whether this is a critical infrastructure worker or anyone else, if you have an employee who becomes sick, actually it's probably on here, you want to identify the spaces they've been in and the people they've come in contact with in the last 48 hours, because then you're going to be having additional conversations and disclosure there. Let me check the chat that came in. If others are okay with it, I might continue for 5 minutes based on these chats. I'll let Laurel speak up though. So employee illness and exposure. To avoid employee illness, MDH has this health screening poster that's really useful. That's just a checklist of the most recent symptoms, and you want to check to make sure that it's updated because they do update it periodically as the symptoms change. But that's a really helpful thing that you can give to your employees and say, we expect everybody to screen for symptoms. Don't come to work if you're sick. So if you have an employee who is sick before they come to work, they report that they have symptoms, how you're going to proceed depends on whether they are under a quarantine or an isolation order, or whether you're kind of following agency guidance. So they might actually have a letter from a provider, from a doctor that says they are under a quarantine or isolation order. And given the size of the organizations, most of you, like the vast majority of you actually, are subject to this new federal law, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And under that federal law, you have to provide paid sick leave, 2 weeks of paid sick leave to any employee who is under a quarantine or isolation order. So it's important, it's going to be important to know if there's actually an order or not, or what the circumstances are in terms of the person's symptoms. So you may need to provide a paid leave, or otherwise you look to agency guidance. And the agency guidance has changed in terms of how long people have to stay out of work, both if they've been exposed and if they're sick. So if they're sick right now, what the CDC says is they should stay out of work for 10 days since they first had symptoms, plus 3 days without a fever, and that's without fever reducing medication. You know, anybody who's a parent of young kids probably is familiar with the idea of giving a little bit of ibuprofen or something before you send them to school in the morning. You can't do that in this situation. So 3 days of no fever and 10 days since symptoms first improved or since they first appeared, and you have to have improvement of symptoms with no new symptoms. And after that period of time, somebody can come to work. But it also depends on the healthcare provider's advice. And as we've had more testing available, it used to be that nobody could get tested. Now more people can. With testing available now, there is an alternative way that you can go get tested. And if you test negative twice in 24 hours, then you may be able to be released to come back to work. But if you have somebody who has symptoms, what you'll want to do is check the most updated guidance from the CDC and from the Minnesota Department of Health to make sure you're following kind of the right time frame. It should be said for all of these, if people can work remotely, this is about reporting in person. Anybody who can work remotely, you can let them work remotely, even if they have symptoms, but they're still able to work. If they're like, you know, I don't feel great, but I can work, you can let them work remotely. Laurel, unless you interrupt me, I'm going to keep talking, or unless somebody else interrupts me.
This is great. Please do.
Okay. If you have somebody who's sick at work, so maybe you went through the screening, they felt fine, but during the workday they start to feel sick. First, you want to isolate them. I mean, really, you want to send them home, but it's going to take a second. So isolate in whatever way. Get them home, but don't lose all contact with them, because you need to gather information from them about the individuals that they've come in contact with at work in the last 48 hours and the spaces they've been at work in the last 48 hours. Maybe you have individual offices and they can tell you they haven't had a conversation with anybody and the only place they've been is they went straight from the door to their office and they never left. That's going to put you in a different place in terms of disclosure to other people and disinfecting than, for example, we got a call from somebody who ran a call center. Everybody's in one room and there are cubicles, but not very high cubicle walls. And they just had to shut down. I mean, immediately for the day they had to shut down. So you gather information about who they've come in contact with, and then you have to contact those people to disclose to them that they may have been exposed, and then you disinfect. And the current guidance is to actually close down for 24 hours before you disinfect. But that's all stuff that, all of these are things that if it happens, you're going to want to look at the most current guidance, and there'll have to be probably some Googling involved. We got a question in advance about what happens if an employee doesn't report that they've been exposed, but another employee knows that so employee A has been exposed but doesn't tell the employer, and employee B finds out. What should employee B do? They probably should notify a manager, but this is something that's going to be hard to put in your policies, and you don't really want to. You want to have part of your policies to be a requirement that people report. If they've been at work in the last 48 hours, they need to report. But employers are only liable for the information that they have. So if employee B, there's a question about liability against employee B. I think that's probably too much to get into all of those details right now. But in general, if you have an employee who doesn't report and you find out that they put people at risk, that could be a situation where you would be able to terminate, where you would want to and be able to terminate somebody for not following the policy of disclosing. Employee exposure. If somebody has been exposed to COVID outside of the workplace, kind of like the test from the last one, critical infrastructure, whether they're symptomatic or not, if you're not a critical infrastructure employer, keep them out of work for 14 days for the quarantine period. I talked about these. I'm not gonna, because of the time, I'm not gonna keep going on these, but this is why I have more detail in these slides. There's new federal legislation. Every employer with fewer than 500 employees has to provide, between now and the end of December, you have to provide 2 weeks of paid sick leave for COVID-related issues, and you have to provide 10 weeks of paid FMLA leave, even if you're not otherwise an FMLA eligible employer, which some of you are not, many of you are not, for individuals who have to be out of work to care for their children because of a school or daycare closure. So the paid sick leave basics, you're going to get copies of the slides, so I'm not going to go over them, but the idea is the person can't work or telework. If they can telework, then they're not entitled to this leave. But either because they're sick or they're caring for someone who's sick, or because the school or place of care, daycare is closed. And then the paid FMLA, you get 12 weeks of leave, 10 of which is paid, but that's only for people who need to care for children. 46% of you have fewer than 50 employees, so you should know for both of these there are certain exemptions you might qualify for. So you would want to pay attention to these if you, you need to pay attention to them. You need to provide, there's a notice poster you need to provide to your employees either way, even if you take the exemption, and it's a limited exemption, but you may be able to get out of it. Both of these, you get a dollar for dollar tax credit in your employment taxes. So your nonprofits, but your employment taxes, you get a dollar for dollar credit. I think, Laurel, I'm probably better off, I'm just going to summarize the last couple of points. If you have somebody who does not want to come back to work because they are at high risk, they have an underlying health condition, they may be entitled to leave under one of those laws. They might be entitled to leave under FMLA if they've got a doctor's note that says that they can't go out in public, essentially, because of their risks. You might also want to provide just a reasonable accommodation if you can, let them work from home or give them a leave of absence if they need it. But that becomes kind of a specific, each individual decision. One thing that we've seen a number of employers come up against, though, that I want to make sure you don't, is you cannot prohibit people from coming to work just because they are at higher risk. So it would be considered a form of disability discrimination. If someone has an underlying health condition and you say, well, because of your condition, I don't want you coming in because it's higher risk, that's disability discrimination. You can't do it. For people who are over the age of 65, that's been identified as a risk, as a higher risk group of people. You also cannot prohibit people from coming to work. That's age discrimination. So we have to leave it to people to decide what they're comfortable with their risk, and you can provide accommodations and things like that. In the case of a disability, you have to engage, you have to talk about reasonable accommodations. But you as the employer should not affirmatively say, you are not allowed to come to work because you're higher risk. I think that's probably the best place to leave off. You all will get copies of the slides. I'm looking at the chat and the Q&A just to see.
Yeah. Awesome, Sarah. Wow. So incredibly helpful to have an expert with organized information like that to inform all our organizations. We just can't thank you enough. And thanks for spending a little extra time with us. Thanks as well to everyone who joined the webinar today. And please watch for the after session email you'll get that we call our e-goodie bag. It's going to have a survey. Please respond to that. It's going to have Sarah's slide deck with hopefully the links. I believe that they'll be live links in that for you, and probably the recording as well. We'll be able to share the recording of this session. So it's a great resource, and I'm happy as well to field any additional questions that we didn't get to today. and to follow up with our members as well. So this is going to bring us to the close of today's Zoom conversation. Thank you again, Sarah. We'd like all of our members to consider, are there topics today that you'd like us to follow up with, things that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk with your network about. We're committed to supporting our network and being relevant during this challenging time. So please feel free to reach out and contact us. This concludes our session today. And so please be well and best wishes to everyone. Thank you.